Good morning, everybody. My name is Fadhel Kaboub. It's my pleasure to join you via this pre-recorded video. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join you in person in Addis. My intervention today is titled Decolonizing Africa's Economic Structures, the Prerequisites for a Just Transition and Gender Equality. Let me start by uh, displaying this image that many of you have seen. It's the old colonial extraction from the African continent, and unfortunately, under the label or the guise of a green transition, we're also in the process of seeing the same kind of extraction. And one of the points that I'd like to highlight for us today is that the old colonial extraction from the continent had a gender dimension to it, and we cannot afford to see the continuation of a new wave of green neocolonial extraction that also continues to reproduce the same gender hierarchies on the African continent and in the global South in general. So, to begin with, we want to understand, what did colonialism do to Africa economically speaking? Remember that colonialism was not designed for industrialization or democracy or peace or justice or development. Colonialism was not supposed to produce human rights or gender equality for that matter, or none of the sustainable development goals. Similarly, colonialism was a non-democratic, violent, abusive, extractive system that produced all the results that we've seen during the colonial period. But I also want to highlight that colonialism imposed on Africa three core economic roles that continue to persist to this day. Number one, Africa was supposed to be the source for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still continue to play that role to this day. Number two, Africa is supposed to be the consumer of industrial output and technologies from the global north, and we continue to play that role to this day. And number three, and most importantly, we're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to us under the label of development, cooperation, job creation. But effectively, what it does is that it permanently locks us at the bottom of the hierarchy, at the bottom of the global value chain. And we still continue to play this role to this day. So, to sum up, essentially, if colonialism was not supposed to produce development or human rights or democracy, why do we expect the same colonial economic roles that were imposed on the continent? Why do we somehow expect the same structures to somehow produce justice or gender equality or development or human rights or development and industrialization somehow, or a decarbonization of of the system, or a just transition? So what we're describing here, the system that persists, is a system that was designed to produce intentional economic entrapment. And that is the system that we must decolonize if we're serious about a transformation that will deliver a just transition, that will deliver justice for all. Furthermore, colonial taxation, I argue, and the uh, Eurocentric gender hierarchies that were introduced on the African continent play a significant role in our history and continue to play a significant role in the gender hierarchies that we see on the continent to this day. So, the first point is that colonial taxation actually introduced Eurocentric gender hierarchies and norms in Africa. And I'll be able to explain this in a minute. If you're interested in the literature on this, I'll highlight just three pieces of literature that I encourage all of you to take a look at, and I'm happy to share the resources. Colonial taxation structures and its impact on women in Kenya. Taxation and primitive accumulation, the case of colonial Africa, and taxation, women, and the colonial state. Um, Very important pieces of literature that I would like to share with you. And I'm happy to share resources later. These are available online. But essentially, the argument is the following. If you think of what the colonial authorities did when they first arrived on the African continent, they wanted to mobilize labor to work for the colonial authority, to extract resources for the industrial development of the global north, of Europe in particular. And taxation was imposed on men, not on women. So if men's work is taxable, it created this notion that men's work is important and women's work is less important, less valuable, unpaid work. Whereas prior to the colonial taxation system, it wasn't like on the African continent, there were no gender roles in the production system, but those roles were not hierarchical, they were complementary. Yes, women performed certain tasks within the household, within the subsistence economy. Men performed other tasks, but they were viewed and considered within African societies and cultures as complementary, not hierarchical. But when the Europeans arrived with the Eurocentric, or rather, I should say, Victorian notion of the role of women in society, the taxation was imposed on men, and as a result, paid work became associated with men. Unpaid work, devalued work, was associated with the role of women, and that was a colonial hierarchy that was introduced, and unfortunately, it persisted in the post-independence era. So the argument that we're trying to lay out here is that we must decolonize our economic structures, including the gender roles that were imposed via colonial taxation, and that persist to this day. So, an important set of messages for us to start with is number one, we can't decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. Similarly, we can't democratize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. And also, we cannot degenderize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet. In other words, we cannot fully decolonize the economy without decolonizing the Eurocentric gender norms that were imposed during colonial times. And that is really the unfinished business of decolonizing African economies that we must set up as a prerequisite for a just transition and for the kind of transformation that we want to see on the African continent. So, to begin, we must highlight the structural deficiencies that our economies deal with today. First, there's the issue of external debt, high levels of external debt. Last year alone, for example, Africa paid more than $160 billion in debt service. That's $160 billion in 1 year alone paying interest on the debt. Of course, that consumes a huge amount of fiscal policy space, which obviously has austerity implications, which of which the gender imbalance is clearly puts a huge burden on women in African societies. The major root causes of external debt, I would argue that this external debt is actually a symptom of deeper structural issues that can be summarized in three major points. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. And number three, low value added industrialization. And as you all know, no country can function without food, without fuel, and without some basic manufacturing base. And the African continent is by design deficient or made deficient in these three areas. On the energy front, for example, take our largest exporter of oil on the continent, Nigeria, or the second largest, Angola. They're major importers of fuel themselves, which means they've been denied access to the technology and the old energy system, technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, to refine oil. And in the new energy system, the entire continent is denied access to financing for renewables and is denied access to the technology to manufacture and deploy renewables at scale. Food deficits. Africa today, according to UNCTAD, imports 85% of its food, where less than 100 years ago, we used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers for the rest of the world. That transformation didn't happen by accident. That's the rules of international trade that have created heavy agricultural subsidies in the global north to displace African farmers from producing the core crops that we need for our subsistence, with starting with wheat, corn, soybean, rice, and so on, that forced the African continent to specialize in exporting cash crops, coffee, tea, tobacco, cacao, and all kinds of supplementary food items. So we produce what we don't consume and we consume what we don't produce. And that is a major deficiency. And then finally, the kind of industrialization that we were allowed to have on this continent is really we wouldn't even be able to call it proper industrialization because it's the kind of manufacturing base that requires you to import the machines, to import the fuel to power the factories, to import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So we end up with a manufacturing base that produces and exports low value added content, and what we import is high value added content. So no matter how much you double, triple, or quadruple your exports via trade agreements and partnerships, you're always locked in a structural trap. So these three deficiencies produce a structural trade deficit year after year, and a trade deficit, as you know, weakens the value of our currencies relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. And with the weaker currency, everything we import the next morning, food, fuel, or medicine, will be imported at a higher real cost. So we literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of our economy, food, fuel, and medicine, which creates the risk of social unrest. And that forces our governments into a defensive position to do two things. One is we try to subsidize food and fuel and health services as much as possible, and that's unsustainable after decades. And two, we ask our central bankers to stabilize the exchange rate. And the band-aid solution they use is by borrowing more dollars and feeding into that external debt trap. So that immediately gives the external lenders the upper hand in micromanaging and determining what we use that borrowed money for, and therefore to prioritize extractive economic activity that continues to reproduce the colonial relationship. And of course, impose austerity by minimizing government spending on social services. And that austerity, of course, disproportionately affects women and vulnerable people within our economies. So again, the colonial relationships continues to reproduce those hierarchies that we've highlighted a minute ago. And here's some of the data just to look at it. This is Africa's exports as a continent. You can eyeball the problem right there. We export raw materials, we export cash crops, not core crops, and we export low value added manufactured products. And when it comes to the total volume of Africa's exports is $747 billion. The total value of our imports is $866 billion. So we have a structural trade deficit on a continental scale. And again, you can eyeball the composition of what we import. It's core crops like wheat and rice and corn, refined petroleum products, medical products, high value added manufacturing products. So those are the structural traps that we must escape. And here's an example. I just picked Mozambique, but I could have picked Ethiopia. I could have picked any other African country. As a matter of fact, you can click on that link right there, and you can pick any country you want to see on the continent. You'll see very similar structures. So here's Mozambique. Mozambique's exports are $10 billion, and you can see it's all raw materials, essentially low value added content and cash crops. And now look at Mozambique's imports. It's almost double, $19 billion. And the composition of the imports is core crops, refined petrochemicals, and high value added imports. That creates this constant downward pressure on the value of the Mozambican metical relative to the US dollar. So the exchange rate is weakening year after year, decade after decade. And with the weaker currency, everything Mozambique imports becomes more expensive. So Mozambique imports food and fuel and medicine at a higher and higher cost year after year. And that puts a lot of pressure on the government and a lot of pressure on the most vulnerable people in Mozambique. So the flip side of it is that Mozambique tries to offset it by borrowing more and more dollars every year. And that's why we call it a debt mountain, because you can see it's the shape of a mountain that continues to increase year after year, decade after decade. And that's not unique to Mozambique. So if we zoom out and look at this on a global scale, if you just focus on the green line for a second, what we have there is the net wealth extraction from the global south. In other words, if we divide the world into global north and global south, and we net out all financial transactions, exports, imports, foreign direct investment, remittances from workers, debt payments and debt relief and interest payments and even illicit financial flows, the net amount is that green line. And the last data point we have right there is $2 trillion moving from the global south to the global north. In other words, you can see also that green line has been accelerating since the 1990s, which means the neo-colonial extraction machine is still doing what it was designed to do, which is extract wealth from the global south. In other words, if we don't do anything about the global economic architecture, these numbers will continue to increase. And if we summarize where we are in terms of climate finance, since we're talking about this in the context of an African climate summit, this is the summary of where we are in terms of climate finance. You have $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction from the global south to the global north. You have next to it $300 billion of climate finance pledged at COP29 and not yet delivered. Most of it is loans and further economic entrapment. Next to it, that green circle is basically what we have in the Green Climate Fund. The last time I checked, it was about $16 billion. And then that tiny dot on the left-hand side of your screen is basically the loss and damage fund, which doesn't even have $1 billion in it, not even close. And now compare that to the annual profits of the big four extractors of fossil fuels on the continent, you will not find a single climate fund that matches the annual profits of these fossil fuel companies. And this is really the summary of how unserious the world is about climate finance, about climate change. And this is the picture I usually ask people to take a screenshot of or take a selfie with and send it to your favorite climate negotiator before they go to COP so that we know where to start the negotiations. This is not gonna put a dent in terms of the climate action that we need if we have this colonial economic extraction engine still in place. And that's why we insist on decolonizing as a process through which we can decarbonize and we can deliver the kind of change we want. So, structural solutions, to be very brief here, and I insist on Pan-African Global South cooperation for strategic investments in key areas. Number one, food sovereignty and agroecology, not just food security. Food security is a very dangerous colonial concept, by the way, that's designed to produce insecurity because it forces us to specialize in cash crop exports and relying on imports of our core crops. That's essentially what we do today. Number two, strategic investments in renewable energy sovereignty, as in manufacturing the renewable energy infrastructure, not just renewable energy to export to other countries, but rather to deliver to the 600 million people on the continent who have no access to electricity as we speak. And number three, and most importantly, strategic investments in high value added industrial policies, not just high tech assembly line manufacturing, starting with three core areas. Number one, renewables infrastructure to manufacture and deploy the solar, the wind, the geothermal infrastructure that we need on the continent. Number two, clean cooking infrastructure for the 1 billion people today in Africa who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis, mostly women and children. Um, and that is, again, not just industrialization, this is development, this is gender equity, this is a health issue, everything is embedded in the clean cooking potential that we have on the continent. And number three, green public transportation to build the logistics of development and prosperity on the continent. And we have all we need. We have the youngest labor force on the planet in Africa. We have all the raw materials that we need. What is needed is access to the manufacturing technology, which is why we need to insist on transfer of technology, access to life-saving technologies to allow us to unleash this potential. And when it comes to the global economic architecture, it's not just the financial architecture, it's the taxation architecture, it's the international trade and investment architecture that is reforming or transforming the rules of the WTO, especially the rules that are related to access to technology, sharing of technology, intellectual property for key technologies to unleash this potential. And as you all know, the global south in general has this massive renewable energy potential for the continent in particular and the rest of the global south. And of course, all the strategic minerals, the green minerals that we need for this transformation is available on the African continent. So we have all the basic components of this. However, what is missing is the political will to share the technology. And this is where I introduced to you what I call the geopolitical bargain of the century. That is, Africa has a plan for Africa rather than the G7 has a plan for Africa or Europe has a plan for Africa. And this is what I call the $0 Pan-African industrial policy. In other words, we don't actually need external financing. We have labor that we can train, and we pay for our labor with our national currencies. We pay for our raw materials with our national currencies. Where we normally need to borrow dollars is to import the manufacturing technology. And once you import manufacturing technology and you have a debt denominated in dollars, you're forced to rewire your industrial priorities to export goods and services rather than manufacture the building blocks of your own development. Here, we want to invite the rest of the world, the countries that have access to this life-saving technology, to transfer technology, to share technology in a win-win scenario with joint ventures. We're not asking for charity, we're not asking for gifts, we're asking for actual partnership for industrialization, for development. And this is where the role for China, for the EU, for the US, for Japan comes in, because these technologies exist in major economic blocks around the world, but the technology is often withheld. So imagine for a second, we have a block of African or global South countries, let's say 20, 30 countries, because you need economies of scale for industrial policy. Imagine we have the political commitment for joint industrial policies, not national industrial policies. Imagine we've predefined the terms of extraction to protect biodiversity, to protect labor rights, to protect human rights. Imagine we've pre-negotiated the distribution of the value chain, the ownership structure. We've predefined everything on our terms, on African terms. And now we go to a country, say, like China, and say, look, we give you the bargain of the century. If you agree to transfer technology, to manufacture and deploy, let's say, solar at scale in this block of 20, 30 countries, the first movers, here's what we offer you in return. In 10 to 15 years, you double your industrial footprint globally, you double your geopolitical weight globally, you secure your access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. And if we have real development industrialization, all other countries from the global south will want to join this economic bargain. And as a result, we give you privileged access to the largest market on the planet. Remember, we're the global majority. Largest market on the planet with rising purchasing power. I guarantee you China will agree to this bargain. But the idea here is not to position China at the top of the hierarchy, but rather to create the second bargaining chip that we need to reposition ourselves within the global economy. So now we can go to the US, to European countries, to Japan and say, look, we give you the same bargain. If you agree to joint industrial policies and transfer of technology to manufacture wind turbines on our terms, to manufacture and deploy pharmaceutical technology on our terms, whatever building blocks of development we need, geothermal infrastructure, high-speed rail infrastructure. There's plenty of business for everybody. So the idea here is not to position any particular country at the top of the hierarchy, but rather to reposition Africa and the rest of the global south, that is the global majority, at the center of a new international economic order of a multipolar world of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity. And this is really the new international economic order uh, discussion that was alive and well 50 years ago and was made to disappear and was silenced at the time. And this is the time to revive those discussions in the context of climate change and a just transition. For those who are interested more in the geopolitical bargain of the century, I'm in the process of writing a book about this. But if you look up this recent paper I co-authored, the last section of this paper briefly sketches or outlines the terms of this geopolitical bargain of the century. I'm happy to share the link to the paper as well. So to conclude, the time to act is now. The crisis that we're dealing with calls for bold, urgent, and radical action. Radical as in going to the roots of the problem, because if we don't go to the roots, we operate at the surface level. That's what we call superficial intervention. That's what reproduces the status quo. So we cannot afford any superficial intervention. We need radical action, as in going to the roots of the problem. And that is really the call that we need to deliver to our negotiators when we go to COP, the African negotiators, the G77 negotiators, and so on. National industrial policies will fail unless they are linked with regional and continental value chains, because industrial policy requires economies of scale. Most of our countries are too small to actually have industrial policies. If you try it alone, you end up manufacturing a small component in somebody else's industrial policy. And Pan-Africanism, Global South unity, Global North solidarity are the economic and geopolitical prerequisites for development, for industrialization, for a just and equitable transition, and for gender equality and a multipolar world of peace, justice, and sustainable prosperity. We will not have the fiscal policy space to deliver the social services, to deliver the kind of development that doesn't put the austerity burden on women and the most vulnerable people in society, unless we have real development, real industrialization, in a just transition framework. And that requires that structural decolonization of our economy, which requires this geopolitical leverage to force the transfer of technology, to transform the global hierarchies that we're dealing with. And I truly believe that this better system is within reach. It's like this real Wakanda is right there within reach, and it is possible, desirable, and affordable. And I'm happy to answer any questions. If there are questions that emerge via social media or via email, you have my contacts. Thank you very much. Amasegenallu.